Hello everybody and welcome to another Throne and Liberty video where this time we're going to talk about the staff crossbow combination and how you can maximize your DPS when playing it. Now this is a bit of an off meta combination, but don't let that fool you. Yes, there are a few downsides which we'll talk about in a bit, but this combination is unreasonably good at DPS and it's actually very easy for you to top out in dungeons. In fact, I actually think this combination is kind of a hidden gem, so if you are interested in it, keep watching because we're going to try and cover everything about it. As always, timestamps are available below if you just want to skip to skill build, gearing guide, or any other section that you'd like to see. For more MMO related content, make sure to subscribe to my channel below, but let's stop delaying and let's stop dallying and jump right into it. So this combination synergizes really well together and is based around two things: constant movement and damage over time through burning. We basically fight from mid-range, only getting within melee range for one skill, so 95% of the time you need to be moving and not standing close or standing still at all. Really the only time it's okay to be standing still is if it's a boss fight and you have a good tank that's always drawing aggro and there's no danger of you being chased by the boss. So that's kind of the general playstyle of the combination, keeping your distance and constantly moving. Now we'll get into the details in a bit, but before we do, we need to acknowledge that there are a couple of major downsides to this combination. The first is that area of effect damage isn't quite as good as the staff longbow or staff wand. The crossbow is simply not an area of effect focused weapon, so you do lose a bit of that. The second issue is that there's not a lot of self-sustain. Now I say not a lot, but really it's pretty much zero. So you need to be careful when you're soloing because getting hit with this combination kinda sucks really bad. That said though, there are a couple of major upsides to this combination as well. Firstly, it makes up for that reduced area of effect damage by being absolutely amazing at single target DPS. This makes you really valuable in boss fights and you'll often top out those DPS charts in dungeons because of it. The second thing is that since we're never really standing still, self-sustain actually isn't that big of a deal since you end up getting hit way less as a result. Now the last thing I want to mention, and I'm being super honest here because fraud is a crime, is that this combination is not very good when you're solo early on in the game. Now when I say early on, I don't mean during leveling. I mean when you've just reached endgame and you're starting to do abyss dungeons and such, you might struggle just a bit. But don't worry too much about it because this does change a lot. As you gear up and improve your health regen and magic and ranged endurance values, you're gonna start clearing dungeons incredibly fast. But okay, alright, we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's start by looking at the skill build. Okay, so as with any other combination, you've got 12 active skill slots and 8 passive skill slots. Let's start with the active skills and their specializations. The first skill we're going to pick up is from the crossbow weapon, and that is quick fire. Now this is your basic crossbow attack, and the specializations we're going to pick for this are gale and min chain fire. These add the gale effect to this skill, which is basically a delayed explosion, and the min chain fire increases the number of hits by 1. After that, we're going to take serial fire bombs with the specializations focused fire bombs, mobility, and projectile speed increase. These specializations change this skill into focused fire bombs, which hits harder and does AoE splash damage. Mobility makes it so that you can cast it while moving, and increased projectile speed helps increase DPS. Third, we have Merciless Barrage, which is another crossbow skill, which is pretty much the only area of effect attack on the crossbow. The specialization we'll choose for this one is Annihilation Barrage Shot, which changes it to an attack that does AoE damage in a circle around you instead of a cone in front of you. Next, we have Chain Lightning, which is another AoE damage skill which does more damage to targets that are currently burning. The specializations we're going to choose for this one are both called Damage Transfer, but it just makes it so that it always chains between enemies and there's no drop off in damage when it does. You should use this skill whenever possible, but you should try to make sure that burning is applied beforehand for maximum damage. Next, we have Recoil Shot. This one's kind of an interesting skill where whenever you use a skill that makes you move, you gain something called Repulsive Force, and this skill consumes it to do damage. The specializations we choose are Wave Shot and Offhand Weapon Attack. Wave Shot basically changes this skill somewhat so that whenever you have 3 stacks of Repulsive Force, it does a lot more damage. Offhand Weapon Attack just improves the damage a little bit. Then we've got Inferno Wave. This is another staff AoE damage attack which also has increased damage if the target is currently burning. The specializations we're going for in this one are consecutive use and burning, which makes it so that you can use it twice 50% of the time and adds 3 stacks of, well, burning. Then we have Judgment Lightning, the second AoE lightning damage skill from the staff. Just like the other lightning AoE skill, both specializations for this one are called Damage Transfer and they do the same thing, which is to say that it makes it so that it always chains and there's no drop off in the damage when it does. Then we have Infernal Meteor, which is another massive AoE from the staff that actually unfortunately has a pretty long casting time. We don't actually need any specializations for this because this is kind of an extra skill that we have for very specific scenarios that we'll talk about in a bit. So those are the 8 main active skills, and the remaining 4 active skills are actually more like buffs. The first of these is Selfless Diffusion. Now this is a pretty standard self buff that decreases cooldowns and boosts damage. The only specialization we choose for this is Aggression, which basically, contrary to its name, reduces the aggression you gain when you attack, which is pretty nice for staying safe in group content. The next buff is Mana Exchange. This is kind of an interesting skill that consumes some of your health for you to regain mana. The specializations we choose for this one are Skill Effect Enhance, which increases the amount of health consumed and the amount of mana regained, and Stamina Recovery, which basically just adds a little bit of stamina recovery to it, which is nice to have. Next, we have Mother Nature's Protest, which is basically a toggle skill which makes all of your projectile attacks shoot a second projectile. The only specialization we have on this one is Flame Arrow, which converts that second projectile into a, well, flame arrow, which applies burning. The final self buff, and in fact the final active skill of this build, is High Focus. This is a nice little self buff that increases cooldown speed and movement speed. We have the base damage boost specialization on this, which also adds a nice little damage boost to the buff. So those are the 12 active skills of this build. Now there are 8 passive slots, and the first of these slots will be taken up by Mana Ball Eruption. This basically gives you extra damage that scales with mana regen, which is a big focus for this build anyway, so this is a very nice passive to have. The next passive we have is Flame Condensation, which increases the damage over time of burning. And since burning is actually a big chunk of the DPS of this build, this passive is really good to have. The second passive is Mana Amp, which increases max mana and health, which is just straight up always good. Next, we have Forbidden Sanctuary, which just straight up increases skill damage. After that, we have Eagle Vision. This passive boosts your magic and ranged hit chances, and the increase actually goes up with distance. But don't get hung up on that too much. You don't actually need to think about distance at all when you're using this build. Just attack as you see fit, and this boost in general will be more than good enough. Then, we have Ambidexterity. This boosts the damage of your offhand weapon and boosts critical hit. Since we use a mix of skills from both weapons, this passive is good no matter which of those two is actually your offhand weapon. The next passive is Bloodlust. This increases skill damage, and every 10 attacks, it also increases crit damage. This pretty much requires no manual input from you, so it's a nice boost to have that scales a lot as you level it up. The final passive we've chosen is Detection. This one is actually very useful because it makes it so that whenever you get hit, there's a chance that you'll gain additional movement speed and evasion, which can really help you survive if you get mobbed. So those are the 12 active skills and their specializations, and the 8 passive skills that are used in this staff crossbow build. Now before we wrap up this session though, there is one more thing that we need to talk about, and that is the weapon mastery for both the staff and the crossbow. For the staff, we want to put 6 points into the defense line and 9 points into the damage line. For the crossbow, it's the opposite. You want to put 9 points into the defense line and 6 points into the damage line. This is because a lot of our damage actually comes from the staff, and it's also nice to have this extra defense because you are a pretty squishy combination. Of course, this build is available in the link in the description below if you want to just take a closer look at it. But even if you're convinced, you might be asking, alright, well, you've told me what skills I should have, but you haven't really told me how I should use those skills at all. Well, okay, that's fair. So let's look at the rotation and playstyle of this combination. Now in Throne and Liberty, while you can have rotations, I actually think that following strict rotations and following strict loops of skill usage is actually very limiting, and is going to result in you having lower DPS than you probably can achieve. So instead of talking about exact rotations, let's talk about when each of these active skills should be used when you're playing, because knowing when to use which skill is the best way to be good at this game. So let's start with the buffs. First and foremost, Mother Nature's Protest should be toggled on at all times. Now yes, it does increase mana cost, but the increase in DPS is very significant, and it makes sure that you're constantly applying burning, so it's definitely worth having on at all times. Next, Selfless Diffusion and High Focus aren't toggled, but they should be used on cooldown whenever available. These impact your DPS a lot, and there's never really a reason not to keep them up as much as possible. Finally, Mana Exchange on the other hand should only really be used if you have plenty of health and you're running out of mana. It is useful, don't get me wrong, but you don't need to use it outside of that scenario, and you definitely don't need to be using it very often. Then for damage, there's 3 types of attacks: priority attacks, filler attacks, and situational attacks. Priority attacks should be used on cooldown whenever they are available, while filler attacks are best used in between those priority attacks. Situational attacks are only useful in specific scenarios, which we'll talk about in a second. Now, there are 3 priority attacks in this build. The first of these is focused firebombs. This does a very nice chunk of damage and applies burning, which is not just the damage over time, but also boosts the damage of other skills. Next is recoil shot, but only with 3 stacks of repulsive force. Using this skill without 3 stacks of repulsive force is pretty much never recommended, since there's a pretty big difference in the amount of damage that you do. The last priority attack is Judgment Lightning. Now, this skill does do more damage if burning is applied when you use it, but realistically, you don't actually have to think about this that much because you should pretty much have burning applied at all times from your other skills. Okay. Then we have the 3 filler skills. The first of these is Quick Shot. This is a nice basic attack that adds a delayed explosion thanks to Gale and does a nice bit of damage. Then you have Chain Lightning, which is like a miniature version of Judgment Lightning and works almost identically, just with less damage and a smaller cooldown. Again, you don't need to manually make sure burning is applied before you use this because it should be all the time. The final filler skill is Inferno Wave, which is a nice AoE skill that also applies burning. Alright, then the last 2 remaining skills are the 2 situational attacks. The first is Annihilation Barrage Shot, which does a lot of AoE damage in a circle around you. The only problem is that you have to get within melee range, and that makes it kind of risky to use. The second situational attack is Infernal Meteor, which is another very strong AoE attack, but the downside of this skill is that it has a very long casting time during which you can't move at all. So while you cast it, you're pretty much entirely open to attack. Now, both of these skills are still very good in 2 situations. One is if you've gathered a bunch of mobs and you feel safe that they can't do a lot of damage to you while you use these skills. The other is during group content, whether that's a boss or just farming in a group where a tank or another teammate is controlling aggro and you're not in any danger of being hit. In either of these scenarios, both of these skills can become priority attacks because of the amount of damage they can do, but outside of these scenarios, they should be used pretty cautiously. Okay, so those were the skills of this class. Hopefully categorizing them into those little sections helps you understand them a little bit better without forcing you into strict rotations. Okay, so with the skills out of the way, the last thing I want to talk about is gear and stats. As for stats, we're going to put 24 points into dexterity for that DPS, 20 points into wisdom for extra mana and mana regen, and 1 point into perception because it's just left over and there's no better place to put it. Then, as for gear, there's going to be 2 main sets of gear that you'll have over time. One is an interim set that's made up of blue or rare equipment, and one is an endgame set that's made up of purple or epic equipment. So, with that in mind, let's start by looking at the interim set. Now, before I talk about specific pieces of equipment, I want to point out that for this interim set, you don't actually need to match it 1-to-1. Any full set of blues will work perfectly well, since the whole point of this set is just to hold you over while you work on that endgame set. The specific blue pieces I'll be talking about are just my recommendations and where to get them. So, for the main weapon, I recommend the Staff of the Resistance, which you get from completing Chapter 5 of the Codex. For the offhand weapon, I recommend the Steel Flurry Crossbows, which is gotten as a reward from the Spectre's Abyss dungeon. For the helmet, we've gone for Hood of the Resistance, which you get from Chapter 6 of the Codex, and for the cloak, we've gone for the Deadeye's Cloak, which you get as a reward for completing the entry Beginner Cloaks of Victory in the Lithography book. For the chest piece, we go for the Heroic Robes of the Resistance, which you get as a reward for Chapter 10 of the Codex, and for the gloves, we have the Gloves of the Resistance, which you get from Chapter 7 of the Codex. Then, for the pants, we have the Glade Stalker Trousers from Chapter 8 of the Codex, and for the boots, we have the Shoes of the Resistance from Chapter 9 of the Codex. For the necklace, which is our first accessory, we have the Guardian Torque from the Lithography book entry Elemental Necklaces, and for the bracelet we have a Kunzite Bangle, which is gotten as a reward from the Roaring Temple dungeon. For our first ring, we have Rutain's Ring of Wonder from Chapter 4 of the Codex, and for our second ring, we have a Violent Signet, which is from the Lithography book entry Elemental Rings. Finally, for our belt, we use a Regeneration Loop, which is gotten from the Roaring Temple as a reward. And that's pretty much the entire interim set. Now again, and I really want to make this clear, you can swap these blue pieces out as much as you want, because at the end of the day, it's just an interim set to use while working towards the purple gear. Okay, so speaking of the purple gear, what does that set look like? Well, before we talk about that, I want to mention that I'm not gonna go into the specific traits of each piece of equipment in this video because I want to focus more on the equipment themselves and where to get them. That said, there will be a link in the description below to the full build, which does include traits, so make sure you go check that out if you want to know which ones are best. Okay, so in terms of stats, the equipment we'll be going with were chosen to maximize a few things. Firstly, mana regen. This combination is quite mana hungry and we have a passive that boosts damage with mana regen. So maximizing it is a big priority. Then we try to stack as much dexterity as possible since it directly determines our DPS. After that, we add on critical hit chance, cooldown reduction and debuff duration reduction where possible. Okay, so with that in mind, for our main weapon, we're gonna go for 2 Blex Shattering Quarterstaff, which is a reward from the Tyrant's Isle dungeon. And for the offhand weapon, we're gonna go for Rex Chimeras' Crossbow, which is a reward from the Temple of Slaughter dungeon. Then for the helmet, we have the Phantom Wolf Mask, which is dropped by Talus the Field Boss in the Raging Wilds area. And for the cloak, we have the Supreme Devotion, which is a reward from the Cave of Destruction dungeon. For the chest piece, we have the Phantom Wolf Tunic, which is a reward from the Tyrant's Isle dungeon, just like 2 Blex Shattering Quarterstaff. And for the gloves, we have the Shadow Harvester Grips, which is a reward from the Temple of Slaughter, just like Rex Chimeras' Crossbow. For the pants, we use the Breeches of the Executioner, which are dropped by the Abyssal Spectres in the Shadowed Crypt, any floor of that dungeon. And for the boots, we have the Shadow Harvester Boots, which is dropped by Tevin, the Archboss. Now, Tevin isn't actually available right now. He will be available from the 25th of October onwards, but I don't think you need to worry about this too much because it is still gonna take you quite a while to build up to this endgame gear set, so just take it easy and take it slow. Moving on, for the necklace, we have the Wrapped Coin Necklace, which is dropped by the Grand Aelon, which is a field boss in Pearlite Hill. And for the bracelet, we have the Braces of the Primal King, which is obtained as a reward from the Cave of Destruction dungeon, just like Supreme Devotion. For our first ring, we're gonna go for the Amber Dimensional Band, which is obtained from a Precious Epic Accessory Selection chest. Now you can get one of these chests in exchange for 1 Dimensional Essence Salvation, which in turn is obtained by combining different dimensional soul shards obtained from different co-op dungeons. This can seem a bit overwhelming at first and like it's a lot of work for just a small ring, but again, this game should be a marathon and not a sprint, so just work on it slowly and steadily. For the second ring, we're gonna go for the Band of Universal Power, which is dropped by Queen Belendir, which is another arch boss. Now again, just like Tevin, Queen Belendir is not currently available in the global release, but will be from the 21st of October onwards, so just hang out till then and fight her when she does come out. For the final piece, the belt, we're gonna go for the Girdle of Spectral Skulls, which is dropped by Atentus, which is a field boss in the Ruins of Terrain. And that pretty much covers all the items in the endgame gear set for this combination. Again, if you're interested in what the specific traits are for each of these pieces, check out the link in the description below for the full build with the traits included. Now before we end this section, I want to add that this game is absolutely not a sprint, especially if you're a free-to-play player. Now if you have enough money to throw around, you could dump enough money into the game and just buy these items directly from the marketplace. But if you're a sane person, like most of the players are, grinding for these items and trading these items up is gonna take you a long time, and that's okay. Take your time to go slow and steady and don't burn yourself out, because at the end of the day, this is a game and you should be having fun. And there you have it. That was the all-in-one guide to the Staff Crossbow combination in Throne and Liberty. I've been playing this combination since the game launched globally, and it's definitely one of the most fun classes I've played so far. Yes, it's not the easiest because you really do need to pay attention to make sure you're avoiding getting hit, but in my opinion, a higher skill ceiling just makes a class more fun. Besides, once you do learn to use it effectively, it becomes an insane class capable of being around the top in most activities in the game. Anyway, I hope I've encouraged you to give this combination a go, or if you already are, helped you understand it a little bit better. As always, make sure to subscribe to my channel below for more MMO related content, but beyond that, thank you for watching and I'll see you guys next time.